Following those video transmissions from yesterday, I woke up really impressed to go into the transition particular to that state between that sort of scholarly gathering information phase, the intellectual debate against the superconscious phase, and how that transitions into that experience of fifth dimensional consciousness where you're able to separate yourself from space-time or from the time wheel and come into alignment with source and with that experience of the perfect harmony and beauty of everything in the universe. The key to this transition is the cultivation of courage. This is honestly where I feel many of you are probably at, considering you're online, you're gathering information, you're listening to videos, and a great signifier of being in states beyond this is that you're actually actively creating and taking the initiative to build your dream world already. And so if you haven't stepped into these states, this is a really important message for you and a really important key, because courage is going to be the only way that you're going to be able to get past this. Now, I talked about how the transition from the theoretical knowledge, from the study and the understanding, into the actual experiencing of this higher state comes through several paths kind of simultaneously. On the tree of life, that's represented as the transition from Netzach and Hod and Yesod to going up into Tippereth. So this is the 6, 7, and 8, and 9, this part of the tree of life. And if you look at this part of the tree of life, what you have here is a bow. This is known as Sagittarius's bow. And you have the handle of the bow, right, or the wood, is formed by the path of the devil and death. And then the strings are formed by the sun and the emperor, with the middle being temperance, which is the alchemy, right? This is also the card of Sagittarius, and so this is Sagittarius's arrow sitting upon that bow. And it's about creating this bow to pull the tensions tight enough to launch you from out of this space-time realm and out of this perspective of being stuck in this cyclical existence of samsara, into that perspective away from it that's in line with source, that you could actually witness for yourself the harmony of the divine perfection. So in doing this means that essentially the path of the devil and the path of death are the two main factors in this, because this has to be built so solid within your being that when you come to make this transition and you put that tension upon your experiences that were forged upon those pathways, that the tension holds and you're able to launch that arrow or launch your consciousness back out into essentially where your higher self or God self is. And in magic, this is also known as the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. So depending on where you're coming from and what your background is, these different terminologies are essentially interchangeable. We're all talking about the same experience. There's only one reality, and it doesn't really matter what the terminology is. It just matters that you understand essentially the mechanics of what's going on for you to come into these states. And so, first of all, being being mortal, essentially, is the greatest fear that we face. The fear of death, until it's encountered head on, is a fear that dominates almost everybody. Well, it dominates everybody until you've taken it on. The fear that you will not continue after you die is really a motivating force for almost all activities for people in these states of consciousness. And so putting yourself out there, going beyond where you deem is safe into the unknown, feels very dangerous. It actually will feel like death. And then on the flip side of it, with the devil being there, right? The devil is just that symbol that's concealing the light. That's concealing the truth of the reality from you behind what you perceive as evil, because if the universe is all-encompassing, all aspects of existence must be included within that. And so this is essentially these parts of the reality that you are purposefully ignoring or neglecting because you perceive them as inherently wrong. But what you perceive as them being inherently wrong is what you inherently perceive wrong of reality and wrong with God and wrong with existence. And this is exactly what's holding you back at these states. And so essentially what you have to do is you have to go beyond the door of what you perceive as the greatest evil to see the higher perspective, to see the archidox beyond this paradox. I've talked many times about what an archidox is. It's a dead word in the English language, but it means that which encompasses the paradoxes. If something exists, right, that means it had to have come from somewhere. It's not ignoring any detail of reality, it's taking everything into account. So if you come up against a paradox or what seems to be a conflicting truth about reality, there must inherently be an archidox that encompasses those paradoxical truths. And so what you're doing here is you're seeking the archidox beyond the paradox of what you are deeming in this duality state as good and evil. And so essentially, to move beyond the intellectual, theoretical knowledge about soul transformation and development of your consciousness and move into that experience state, you have to experientially go beyond these things. And this can be very scary, and this requires courage. But what I don't feel like we really get taught, or it's not really valued in our society the way it was in the old world, is that courage isn't not being afraid of something. It's doing something because it's right, regardless if you're afraid or not. You know, in the old world, the sense of virtue or honor was all about doing what was right for your soul, regardless of if you would die, regardless of if it was considered evil. It was maintaining that sense of honor above all else. And so this is what you're being asked to do at this state, is you're being asked to choose what your soul's telling you, regardless of whether you perceive it to be dangerous or even evil. And this can be, you know, something that holds people back, not just for an entire lifetime, but for lifetimes. To be honest, if you're in this state right now, you've probably come to this state many lifetimes over and stopped in this state and haven't gone beyond it. And this is, you know, at this point in time, you're being especially prodded towards taking this courageous leap. And the fact is that you will face these things very likely head on when you make the decision to go beyond this state. You know, it's not saying, oh, just trust and jump off the cliff and you're going to step right into heaven. No, you're going to step into the ordeals, and the ordeals are going to test it in such a way that you're not afraid anymore. Usually I tend to avoid sharing personal experiences, but for some reason with this, I'm feeling it would be to everyone's benefit to kind of share my own experience through this transition. When I was younger, I got inducted into a mystery school. I was about 22 years old. And within this school, I was in the school for about a year. I learned, you know, many different magical properties. I even experienced some psychic abilities and astral vision and these different things, you know, on my own, and witnessed, you know, countless miracles while I was there. But to me, it still felt like it was very theoretical. I didn't know if I could trust it. I didn't know if I could lean on it. And at this time, specifically, I was really dominated by a fear of everything. Like I feared money. I feared being homeless. I feared, you know, essentially dying because I wasn't good enough, or that if I continued on this path and I didn't, you know, get my standard education and go the route that everybody else was taking, that I wasn't going to make it. And luckily for me, all of my fears actually manifested. I did end up homeless. I did end up losing all my job and had no money and lost my relationship, and every single detail that I was afraid of, I manifested it all perfectly. And what happened was, finding myself in this position, I decided, rather than just giving up or cowering back and asking for help, to really lean into myself and go forward into that abyss and lean on the tools that I learned and go out into the world. And so, I sold everything I had and I took off into Central America, and I got to Costa Rica. And when I got there, the fear of death was stronger than anything I ever imagined. It was right in my face. As soon as I arrived, I had nowhere to stay, and a rainstorm hit, and I was just getting soaked, and I had no plans. I'm just standing there in a foreign country, getting soaked in this tempest, and pretty sure I was gonna die. But what happened was, and on top of this too, I also left my religion before that. And so essentially my devil that I was fighting with was this feeling of nihilism. I fully declared myself an atheist. I decided that, if what I was taught and what I was raised with wasn't true, then everything must inherently be false. And so, I was really being gripped within this despair that nothing really mattered and nothing exists. And although I'd had these experiences of magic that kind of tested the limits of this belief in nihilism, it was really a haunting thought to me. Sartre's question of the most important thing that you can ever figure out. The first question is whether or not you should kill yourself. This thing just went through my head over and over again. It's I got to figure it out. Is this life worth living, or should I just die? And so this journey, was not only testing my fear of death, but it was also testing that fear of evil, the fear that, life was meaningless. That was my greatest fear. That was my greatest evil, is that this was just pointless. And so what was initiated through this journey and arriving in Costa Rica is, before the week was out, I found myself living with a Native American tribe, with the Malecku Indians, who brought us out to their camp for an initiation at all three of their sacred spots. And while I was there, it was this really interesting feeling of oh wow, I was caught. there is something here. There's something that's guiding me. And, after that experience, they invited us to stay on some of the land for a little bit. And we were camping. And one night, this fear of death was still very strong. I had very little money. I didn't know how. I was barely eating anything. I didn't know where I was going to stay. I didn't know how I was going to feed myself. I didn't know how I was going to continue on this journey that I set out, because I committed to myself to get to Egypt and go through an initiation there, and it seemed absolutely impossible. So one night while I'm camping in the jungle, I walk out to town and I buy a chicken, and I come back and I pluck the chicken, and I'm about to cook it over an open fire. And while I'm cooking it, I look out into the tree line, and there's a jaguar right there. And I'm face to face with it, and it's hungry and it's angry. And this is, my fear manifested right there in the flesh. This wasn't some fake out fear of death. This was a wild animal who was hungry that very likely was going to kill me. And it was interesting because as I came face to face with it and looked into its eyes, that fear of death actually just dropped. And it turned from if I'm going to die, it was in that moment, I'm okay, this is how I die. This is it. This is the last moment. And what was interesting for me is, in accepting that moment, into looking into those eyes, that fear of death just dropped entirely. And the first thing that happened was the inspiration came. And the inspiration prompted me to throw the chicken out, and the jaguar went after the chicken, and I was able to run out of the jungle and, got out of the situation that I was sure I was going to die in. But then everything changed. It's like, okay, so what if I didn't have money? So what if I didn't have any plans? So what if I even died on this journey? It became very clear to me. It's like, I'm here for my soul mission. I'm not here, just to live some rinky-dinky life where nothing matters. I'm not going to drift into these depths of despair and of hopelessness. I'm going to go forward. I'm going to see what the world has to offer. And that is when this journey began to open into this entire magical initiation of experience. And even this fear of being homeless, which, I was on the road for 10 and a half months. And this 10 and a half months of being homeless turned out to be the best time of my life up to this point. I loved that entire experience. It was wonderful. I grew more through being homeless for that year and wandering around the earth than anything I could have ever imagined. But this is exactly the point, is that if I would have just stayed home and kept reading books and kept theorizing about this universe and then going into the despair of feeling that nothing mattered without putting it to the test, I would have never known. And so you have to go out there. You have to experience it for yourself. You can't just keep listening to other people. You have to see for yourself if these fears are real, if life actually does matter. And I encourage you to take that step. And that's exactly what I do in magic school, is wherever people are in whatever state of consciousness that they come to me, whatever their experience up to that point, I find where they need to go and I push them into the next initiation, whatever that is. And I'm not afraid to do that because I know that the universe will catch you, but you have to go into it and you have to believe. And so I just felt to add this to supplement the videos that I put up yesterday. But once again, I really encourage you to take that leap.